A remote African savanna, a pride of traumatized wild lions, and a veteran ranger haunted by the lives he couldn't protect. When the poaching crisis exploded across Kenya's Maasai Mara in March 2023, few could have predicted it would forge one of the most extraordinary human-animal bonds ever documented. The drought had been merciless that year. Rivers that once flowed through the heart of the Mara had dwindled to muddy pools, forcing wildlife into desperate migrations toward the few remaining water sources. It was during this vulnerable time that organized poaching syndicates struck with unprecedented brutality. Armed with military-grade weapons and night vision equipment, they systematically targeted the region's most iconic predators, seeking lion bones for illegal traditional medicine markets in Southeast Asia. The Kenyan Wildlife Service had never faced such a coordinated assault on their protected areas. Rangers reported finding lion carcasses stripped of bones and claws, left to rot under the scorching sun. Entire prides were decimated in single nights, leaving orphaned cubs to starve or fall prey to hyenas and leopards. The psychological impact on the surviving lions was unlike anything wildlife experts had witnessed before. Within 6 weeks, the Mara's lion population had plummeted from an estimated 280 individuals to fewer than 180. The survivors displayed behaviors that defied decades of research on lion social structures. Pride bonds were shattered, territorial boundaries collapsed, and many lions abandoned their natural hunting patterns entirely. Some individuals simply vanished into the dense bush, never to be seen again. Conservation organizations worldwide watched in horror as one of Africa's most stable lion populations teetered on the brink of complete social collapse. Emergency funding poured in from international wildlife foundations, but money couldn't heal the deep psychological wounds inflicted on the surviving cats. Traditional conservation methods, relocation, supplemental feeding, increased patrols, seemed inadequate against the magnitude of trauma these apex predators had endured. Local Maasai communities, who had coexisted with lions for centuries, reported that the lions had become ghosts of the savanna. The lions no longer responded to familiar environmental cues, avoided areas where they had previously thrived, and displayed levels of hypervigilance that made normal behavior impossible. Even experienced Maasai warriors, whose cultural traditions were deeply intertwined with lion presence, admitted they had never witnessed such profound behavioral changes in wild predators. The crisis demanded an unprecedented solution, but no one could have imagined that the answer would come from a former military communications specialist whose own battle scars ran deeper than anyone suspected. The Mara Conservation Trust headquarters had become a crisis command center by early April 2023. Radio chatter filled the air as field teams reported another night of unsuccessful attempts to locate and monitor the surviving lion populations. Dr. Sarah Keimani, the Trust's lead wildlife behavioral specialist, stood before a wall-mounted map dotted with red pins marking confirmed poaching sites and yellow pins indicating last known lion sightings. The yellow pins were becoming increasingly sparse. "We're losing them faster than we can track them," she explained to the emergency response team gathered around the conference table. "The surviving lions have fragmented into groups of 2 or 3 individuals, abandoning all normal pride structures. They're avoiding our monitoring equipment, refusing bait stations, and showing zero response to our standard wildlife management protocols." The Trust had been operating in the Mara ecosystem for over 15 years, successfully managing human-wildlife conflicts and maintaining stable predator populations through science-based conservation strategies. Their team of 32 field rangers represented some of Kenya's most experienced wildlife professionals, many with decades of hands-on experience working with dangerous game. Yet none of their established methods were proving effective against the current crisis. The Trust's veterinary team had managed to dart and examine only 3 lions since the poaching surge began. All 3 showed elevated cortisol levels consistent with severe chronic stress, compromised immune function, and muscle atrophy indicating disrupted sleep patterns. Dr. James Mutua, the lead veterinarian, reported that one young male had stress-related ulcers typically seen only in captive animals subjected to extreme psychological pressure. "Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. International wildlife organizations had pledged over $2 million in emergency funding, but financial resources couldn't address the fundamental problem. The lions had lost their ability to trust their environment, and traditional conservation approaches required a basic level of predictable animal behavior that simply no longer existed. Without successful intervention, computer models predicted complete population collapse within 18 months. The Kenyan government had assigned additional anti-poaching units to the region, but the damage extended far beyond preventing future attacks. The surviving lions needed psychological rehabilitation on a scale that no conservation organization had ever attempted with wild predators. The most concerning case arrived at the Trust's temporary field station on April 18th, carried in the back of a Kenya Wildlife Service vehicle by Ranger Captain Moses Nakuru. It was a lioness approximately 4 years old, found unconscious near the Talak River after consuming meat laced with veterinary sedatives, a common poaching tactic used to incapacitate entire prides before the killing began. She had survived only because the dosage was miscalculated for her smaller body weight. Dr. Mutua's initial examination revealed a catalog of psychological trauma symptoms never before documented in wild lions. The lioness, temporarily designated as Mara 7 for tracking purposes, displayed complete muscular rigidity when approached by humans, even while sedated. Her pupils remained fully dilated despite adequate lighting, and her breathing patterns suggested she was locked in a permanent state of hypervigilance. Blood work confirmed cortisol levels nearly 3 times higher than normal ranges for stressed captive lions. Unlike typical wild lion responses that involve either aggressive defensive posturing or strategic retreat, Mara 7 exhibited what behavioral specialists term learned helplessness. When placed in the temporary holding enclosure for medical monitoring, she pressed herself against the furthest corner and remained motionless for hours. She refused to acknowledge food placed within her reach, even high-value prey items that would normally trigger immediate feeding responses in healthy lions. Dr. Kimani attempted standard wildlife rehabilitation protocols developed for traumatized predators. She tried environmental enrichment with set markers from other lion populations, played recorded pride vocalizations to stimulate social responses, and introduced prey animals to encourage natural hunting instincts. Each intervention failed completely. Mara 7 showed no interest in territorial scent marking, did not respond to the vocalizations of other lions, and actually recoiled from the presence of live prey. The most disturbing behavior emerged during the 3rd day of observation. Security cameras captured Mara 7 engaging in repetitive head pressing against the enclosure walls, a neurotic behavior indicating severe psychological distress. She would maintain this position for up to 45 minutes at a time, occasionally emitting low-frequency distress vocalizations that field recordings had never documented in wild lion populations. Veterinary neurologist Dr. Elena Ochieng was consulted via satellite connection from Nairobi University. After reviewing the behavioral footage, she delivered a sobering assessment. This animal is experiencing what we would classify as severe post-traumatic stress disorder if she were human. Her neural pathways have been fundamentally altered by the trauma experience. Without intervention that addresses the psychological component, not just the physical symptoms, she will not recover. The prognosis extended beyond Mara 7 to the entire surviving population. If this level of trauma was representative of other survivors, traditional conservation methods would prove entirely inadequate.
For 3 weeks, the conservation team exhausted every intervention strategy in their extensive protocols. Dr. Kimani brought in lion behaviorists from South Africa's Kruger National Park, experts who had successfully rehabilitated traumatized lions following drought-related stress events. Their techniques, which had shown remarkable success with other traumatized predator populations, produced no measurable improvement in Mara 7's condition. The South African specialists attempted gradual exposure therapy, slowly introducing controlled stimuli designed to rebuild positive associations with the environment. They played recordings of flowing water to simulate safe territory conditions, introduced familiar scents from healthy prey animals, and used remote feeding systems to avoid direct human contact. Mara 7 ignored the water sounds entirely, showed active avoidance of prey scents that should have triggered hunting instincts, and refused all food regardless of delivery method. Wildlife psychologist Dr. Rebecca Thornton flew in from Zimbabwe, bringing specialized equipment for measuring stress responses in large predators. Her advanced biometric monitoring revealed that Mara 7's heart rate remained elevated at 120 beats per minute even during apparent rest periods, nearly double the normal resting rate for adult lionesses. Brain activity scans showed patterns consistent with hyperarousal states that prevented the natural sleep cycles essential for psychological recovery. The team tried pharmaceutical interventions under strict veterinary supervision. Mild anxiolytic medications that had proven effective with captive big cats produced no behavioral changes. Even stronger sedatives only temporarily masked the symptoms without addressing the underlying psychological dysfunction. Dr. Mutua expressed concern that continued pharmaceutical intervention might actually worsen the trauma response by adding chemical stress to an already overwhelmed nervous system. Desperate measures included bringing in traditional Maasai healers, whose cultural practices included rituals for calming aggressive or disturbed lions. Elder Joseph Sankale performed ancient ceremonies outside Mara 7's enclosure, using traditional herbs and vocalizations passed down through generations of warrior culture. The lioness showed no acknowledgement of practices that had historically influenced wild lion behavior for centuries. By early May, camera footage revealed alarming deterioration. Mara 7 had lost an estimated 15% of her body weight despite forced feeding attempts. Her coat showed patches of hair loss from repetitive grooming behaviors, and she had developed pressure sores from remaining in static positions for extended periods of time. Most concerning was the complete absence of normal feline behaviors. No stretching, no grooming beyond the compulsive overgrooming, no environmental exploration whatsoever. The team faced an agonizing decision. Standard wildlife rehabilitation protocols required euthanasia when psychological trauma prevented an animal from exhibiting natural behaviors necessary for survival. The broader implications were devastating. If their most concentrated efforts couldn't help one lioness, how could they possibly address the trauma affecting over 60 surviving lions scattered across thousands of square kilometers of wilderness? Thomas Nakuru hadn't planned to visit the Mara Conservation Trust that humid Thursday morning in mid-May. At 38, his position as a senior communications specialist with the Kenya Defense Forces kept him occupied with coordinating military anti-poaching operations across 3 different national reserves. The recent escalation in organized wildlife crime had stretched his unit beyond normal capacity, requiring 18-hour days coordinating helicopter surveillance missions and ground patrol communications. His sleepless nights weren't just from operational demands. Thomas carried wounds that ran deeper than his official military records indicated. During his second deployment in Somalia with the African Union Mission, his communications unit had been responsible for coordinating evacuation procedures for villages under siege by armed militias. The voices he heard over radio channels, families calling for help that sometimes arrived too late, still echoed in his memory years after returning to civilian life. The transition from active military service to wildlife conservation work had been therapeutic initially. Using his specialized communications skills to coordinate anti-poaching operations felt like meaningful work that aligned with his Kikuyu cultural values about protecting the natural world. However, the recent surge in poaching incidents had triggered familiar feelings of helplessness that he thought he had overcome through years of counseling and meditation practices.
"I'm here to brief your team on the new military communication protocols," he told receptionist Grace Wanjiku at the Trust headquarters. "Command wants all conservation partners updated on our encrypted radio frequencies and emergency response procedures." His precise military posture concealed the fatigue of a man juggling search operations for poaching suspects while processing grim reports of mutilated wildlife remains from field patrols. Thomas had developed what his therapist called hyperacusis, an increased sensitivity to specific sound frequencies that developed following exposure to combat stress. Certain radiostatic patterns, helicopter rotor frequencies, and even some animal distress calls could trigger anxiety responses that required conscious breathing techniques to manage. He had learned to function professionally despite these triggers, but the recent intensity of anti-poaching operations had strained his coping mechanisms. Grace consulted the duty roster and noticed Dr. Kimani was conducting a consultation session with visiting specialists near the temporary rehabilitation facility. "She's with the behavioral team examining our most challenging case," Grace explained. "A lioness rescued from the poaching zone who hasn't responded to any rehabilitation attempts. You're welcome to wait, or I could walk you over to observe the consultation if you have time." Thomas checked his watch, noting he had 40 minutes before his next scheduled communication briefing with helicopter units. The opportunity to see conservation work from a different perspective appealed to him, especially since most of his recent experience involved aftermath documentation rather than rehabilitation efforts. Grace led Thomas across the compound toward the rehabilitation area, past equipment sheds housing telemetry gear and medical supplies. The facility buzzed with quiet activity as veterinary technicians prepared for another assessment session with Mara 7. Through the chain-link perimeter, Thomas could see Dr. Kimani standing with two international consultants about 20 meters from a reinforced enclosure, partially obscured by acacia trees. "The lioness has been here almost a month," Grace explained in hushed tones as they approached the observation area. "Every specialist we've brought in says they've never encountered anything like her psychological state. She won't eat unless the area is completely empty of humans, shows no response to environmental stimuli, and hasn't exhibited a single normal lion behavior since arrival." Thomas positioned himself near the consultation group, maintaining the respectful distance his military training had ingrained when observing specialist operations. Dr. Kimani was explaining treatment attempts to the visiting experts while occasionally glancing toward the enclosure, where a tawny form was barely visible in the far corner. The lioness remained completely motionless despite the presence of multiple observers nearby. Instead of joining the discussion or introducing himself to the specialists, Thomas found himself drawn to a different approach. Without conscious decision, he moved away from the group and settled cross-legged on the ground approximately 15 meters from the enclosure fence. His military communications training had taught him the value of patient observation before attempting any form of contact, whether with human or electronic systems. The afternoon heat pressed down on the compound as Thomas sat quietly, not looking directly at the lioness, but maintaining peripheral awareness of her location. His breathing naturally settled into the rhythm he had learned during military meditation training. 4 counts in, hold for 4, 4 counts out. This technique had helped him remain calm during high-stress communication operations when multiple radio channels demanded simultaneous attention. After 20 minutes of motionless observation, Thomas began producing soft vocalizations under his breath. These weren't words or conventional sounds, but rather low-frequency hums and clicks that resembled patterns he had unconsciously developed during solitary radio monitoring shifts. These sounds served no specific purpose except to create a consistent, non-threatening audio presence that might indicate calm intention to any listening entity. The consultation group continued their discussion 30 meters away,
unaware that Thomas had begun an entirely different approach to interacting with their most challenging patient. Dr. Kimani occasionally glanced in his direction, noting his unusual positioning and methodology, but chose to not interrupt what appeared to be a respectful observation session.
During the 40-minute mark of Thomas's quiet presence, something shifted in the lioness's posture that made Dr. Kimani pause mid-sentence in her conversation with the consultants. For the first time since her arrival, Mara 7 had lifted her head from the rigid position pressed against the enclosure corner. Her amber eyes were now oriented directly toward Thomas, tracking his subtle movements with focused attention that had been completely absent during all previous human interactions. Thomas continued his soft vocalizations, unaware that he was producing sounds remarkably similar to frequencies used by lionesses for close-range communication with their cubs. His unconscious pattern of clicks and low humming fell within the 15-30 Hz range that feline behaviorists recognize as comfort vocalizations, sounds that adult lions use to signal safety and non-aggressive intentions within pride social structures. The breakthrough moment came when Thomas shifted slightly to relieve pressure on his left knee, creating a small rustling sound from his movement. Instead of the immediate retreat response that had characterized Mara 7's reaction to all previous human activity, the lioness maintained her visual focus on him while producing a barely audible vocalization in return. Dr. Kimani's breath caught as she recognized the sound, a greeting chuff that healthy lions use to acknowledge the presence of familiar pride members. Thomas felt, rather than heard, the lioness's response, a vibration that seemed to resonate through the ground beneath him. Without conscious analysis, he instinctively produced a similar low-frequency sound in return, creating what ethologists would later recognize as the first successful two-way communication exchange that Mara 7 had engaged in since her rescue. The interaction lasted less than 10 seconds, but represented a fundamental breakthrough in her psychological isolation. Dr. Thornton, the wildlife psychologist, immediately began recording biometric data from the remote monitoring equipment attached to Mara 7's tracking collar. For the first time in weeks, the lioness's heart rate had dropped below 100 beats per minute, indicating a measurable reduction in stress response. Her muscle tension, monitored through pressure-sensitive floor plates, showed the first signs of relaxation since her arrival at the facility. "Impossible," whispered Dr. Kimani, as she watched Thomas maintain his seated position while the lioness actually took 3 deliberate steps away from her corner. Mara 7 was now positioned in the center of her enclosure, maintaining visual contact with Thomas while displaying alert but non-defensive body language. Her tail, which had remained rigidly tucked for weeks, showed the first natural movement patterns observed by the rehabilitation team. The other consultants stood frozen, recognizing they were witnessing something unprecedented in wildlife rehabilitation protocols. The recognition hit Thomas like a physical blow as he studied the lioness's distinctive facial markings and the specific pattern of scarring along her left shoulder. His military communications training had included detailed wildlife identification protocols for coordinating search and rescue operations. But this wasn't about professional recognition. This was deeply personal. 3 months earlier, during a pre-dawn anti-poaching patrol in the northern Mara sector, his unit had responded to urgent radio reports of wounded lions near the Talik River crossing. Thomas's hands trembled slightly as the memory crystallized. He had been the communications operator coordinating medical evacuation for wounded wildlife found at the poaching site, including a young lioness discovered unconscious near contaminated meat stations. The veterinary team had worked frantically to stabilize her vital signs while Thomas maintained radio contact with aerial support units. He remembered her specific markings because he had been responsible for photographing and documenting all evidence for the criminal investigation file. "Mara 7, he whispered, using the designation that had been assigned during the initial rescue operation. The lioness's ears immediately oriented toward the sound of his voice, and she produced another soft chuff, this one distinctly different from her earlier greeting vocalization.
Thomas recognized it as a sound he had heard during the rescue operation when the sedated lioness had briefly regained consciousness during transport. Dr. Kamani approached slowly, her scientific training warring with the impossibility of what she was observing. "Do you know this animal?" she asked in a carefully measured tones, afraid that any disruption might break the extraordinary connection developing before her eyes.
"I was part of the team that found her," Thomas replied, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. "My unit coordinates communications for all major anti-poaching operations. I was on radio duty the night they brought her in from the Talek site. I remember her markings from the evidence documentation." He paused, studying the lioness who continued to maintain steady eye contact. "We thought she might not survive the sedative poisoning." To verify his theory, Thomas slowly reached into his uniform pocket and withdrew his military radio, still tuned to the frequency used during wildlife rescue operations. When he activated the unit, producing the familiar static burst and electronic tones that preceded official communications, Mara 7's response was immediate and unmistakable. She approached the fence for the first time since her arrival, stopping less than 2 meters from where Thomas sat, and produced a series of recognition vocalizations that seemed to directly respond to the radio sounds. The impossible had become undeniable. The traumatized lioness recognized the man whose voice had coordinated her rescue from certain death. Over the following weeks, Thomas restructured his military duties to spend maximum time at the conservation facility. His commanding officers, initially skeptical about allocating personnel resources to wildlife rehabilitation, became supportive when they realized the unprecedented breakthrough could revolutionize anti-poaching operations. For the first time since the crisis began, they had discovered a method for reaching traumatized lions that showed measurable psychological progress. Mara 7's transformation began with small but significant behavioral changes. When Thomas was present during feeding times, she would accept food within minutes rather than the hours-long delays that had characterized her eating patterns with other staff members. Her repetitive head-pressing behaviors ceased entirely during his visits, replaced by normal feline activities like stretching, grooming, and environmental exploration that indicated returning psychological health. The rehabilitation team documented remarkable physiological improvements as well. Dr. Mutua's weekly blood work showed steadily decreasing cortisol levels, returning toward normal ranges for the first time since her rescue. Her weight stabilized and began increasing as her appetite returned to healthy patterns. Most significantly, sleep monitoring revealed that Mara 7 was finally achieving the deep rest cycles essential for neurological recovery from trauma. Thomas discovered that his own psychological healing was accelerating through his work with Mara 7. The hyperacusis symptoms that had plagued him since his military service began diminishing as he spent more time producing the calming vocalizations that seemed to comfort the lioness. His therapist noted during their sessions that Thomas was reporting fewer nightmares about failed rescue operations and expressing increased confidence in his ability to make meaningful differences in crisis situations. The breakthrough with Mara 7 led to expanded protocols for working with other traumatized lions throughout the Mara ecosystem. Thomas began training conservation rangers in modified communication techniques that incorporated elements of his military radio procedures with lion-specific vocalizations. 3 additional traumatized lions showed positive responses to these hybrid approaches, suggesting that the connection between human technology sounds and feline comfort responses might be more universal than initially believed. Dr. Kimani published preliminary findings in the Journal of Wildlife Rehabilitation, documenting the first successful case of using military communications protocols as therapeutic intervention for traumatized large predators. The research attracted international attention from conservation organizations dealing with similar trauma-related challenges in lion populations across Africa. 6 weeks after their reunion, Thomas received approval to participate in Mara 7's release preparation.
The lioness had progressed to the point where wildlife specialists deemed her psychologically ready for supervised reintroduction to controlled wild territories, with Thomas serving as part of the monitoring team to ensure successful transition. The morning of Mara 7's release dawned clear across the northern Mara Conservancy, with Thomas wearing his familiar military communications gear that had become a comfort signal for the lioness. The release site had been carefully selected, a protected area with abundant prey and water sources, monitored by remote cameras that would allow the team to observe her reintegration without human interference. Unlike typical wildlife releases where animals immediately flee to established territory, Mara 7 approached the transport crate opening cautiously, looking directly at Thomas before taking her
First steps into freedom. She paused at the threshold between captivity and wildlife, producing one final recognition chuff that seemed to acknowledge both her rescuer and her readiness to reclaim her natural existence. Thomas activated his radio one last time, sending the familiar electronic tones across the savannah. Mara 7's ears oriented toward the sound, and for a moment that stretched between human and wild worlds, their eyes met in mutual understanding. Then she turned and walked steadily toward the acacia groves, her movement confident and purposeful, a predator reclaiming her rightful place in the ecosystem. 6 months later, camera trap footage confirmed what the monitoring team had hoped to see. Mara 7 had successfully integrated with a small pride of survivors, establishing territory and displaying all normal lioness behaviors. The psychological wounds inflicted by human cruelty had healed through an unexpected connection with human compassion. Thomas continues his dual role, coordinating anti-poaching communications while developing revolutionary rehabilitation protocols that have now helped over 20 traumatized lions across Kenya. His work proves that sometimes the most profound healing occurs when two wounded souls, human and wild, find understanding across the boundaries that typically separate species. This story demonstrates that in our fractured world, connection transcends expectation, healing flows both ways, and hope emerges from the most unlikely encounters. If this incredible true story moved you, hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who needs to believe in the power of unexpected bonds. Help us continue bringing these amazing stories of resilience, connection, and the unbreakable spirit that exists in both humans and the magnificent creatures we share this planet with.